Okay, so I am very, very excited and proud of all of you for showing up for the last session here. This is a very, thank you. So we're going to be talking about tips for Web Forms 4 applications. I'm going to be showing off a lot of cool features that are in Web Forms 4 and talking about, there have been, like I was looking back at PDC09, there was a really good talk on Web Forms 4 features, and it was kind of more like a feature list. And so what I wanted to do in this scenario is go through, take a look at a, ugly, busted site that your nephew's cousin, the hairdresser, made, and like fix it up so it's usable and add in these features. So as we're going through this, please ask any questions, because that's going to make it a lot more useful to everybody. So yeah, like I said, our objective, we're going to take this old and busted site, and the idea is, instead of Northwind this time around, I'm using the Chinook database. Who here has heard of that Chinook database? Okay, so it's out on codeplex.com. This is just if you need sample data. It's kind of more fun to work with. It's pulled in from like music store application. And here's my kind of feature list of things we'll walk through. We're going to look at dynamic data. And before, it's always been a problem with dynamic data that it was another project type you could use. You could say, okay, I'm doing my ASP.NET web form site. I could do an MVC site, or I can do a dynamic data site. So how many people here have actually used dynamic data? Okay, right, because it's a pain to actually, you got to buy into it. So we're going to look at how you can turn it on for an existing data grid in your site. We'll look at cleaning up HTML and then what that'll do for you. Routing, we're going to look at turning on routing for a web form site. Has anyone used that yet? Okay, good. So this will be helpful. A little bit on AJAX enhancements. Some of the things in AJAX are in flux due to the announcements that came out on this week. So actually some of my demos that I was going to do there are not as relevant, but we'll talk about what's changed and what's new. And then we'll look at charting. So first of all, let's go over to the demo here. So we're going to look at, we're starting with a very simple, so the idea here is we've got a data grid that is as if you had just dropped a table onto a form. So you've got your SQL expressions and all that. So not very useful. I could run this as just basically a data grid where you've got an editable list of stuff. So the first thing we're going to look at, well, actually let's take a look at it, because this is just your standard grid on a web page, and when you run that, you're going to get there's no style to it, right? That's one of the problems that you got before in existing web forms apps, is you just got that as on the page. So one thing that's nice in the new ASP.NET web forms is that it kind of steals over a feature that was in MVC, and that's the idea of a template. So when you create a new website using ASP.NET 4, MVC, or web forms, you're going to get a clean styled template. So the first thing that we would do here is just drag that site, copy it over into a new site. And then you're going to get that. So we'll talk more about doing that in a little bit. But you're going to see, I'm pointing that out because you're going to see that I'm using a new template, and there's all of a sudden the look of the site's going to change. So let's look at what we would need to do, first of all, to change this data grid over to take advantage of dynamic data. So let me see if I have a separate little slide for that. Okay, that was that. So like I said before, you had to go through and create a dynamic data site. And we'll actually look at that in a second, because nobody here had, maybe one or two hands went up for having used that. But what you can do now is you can enable dynamic data for a lot of the grids and several different data-bound controls. So when we say enable dynamic data, we turn on a lot of these cool features. So in this example, we're going to look over here. So we've got that one line that I've added in here. So this is track list, and track list is the is the name of my grid here. And so when I do that, that enables that dynamic editing features. And let me see. Go ahead and view in browser. Looks like I've already got it going. Okay. Sorry about this. My computer's running a little slow today. Let me skip over to another one because I've got another feature that I want to show off with this anyways. So this is the exact same kind of grid. What this is going to also show off a different feature, an additional thing, which is that once you've got dynamic data enabled, you can then turn on a lot of other things. So this is an editable data grid. And in this, when we click on edit, now we have editing, but this, when you normally, my original form didn't come up, so I couldn't show this well. Normally, when you edit, if you don't have validation figured out, or you don't have your validation set, you're not going to get validation messages. You're not going to get clean error messages. And so let me see if this one does. So here, if I say update, you'll see here that we have the star next to the field that wasn't populated correctly, and we also have a validation summary at the top. So this is something that you would have had to write a lot of custom code for in the past. And all we had to do here is we said on that item, the same thing here. This one is done in line. So there's two things to notice here. So it's, again, that grid view 1, enable dynamic data, type of product. So type of product is the actual, whatever you're binding to. And then you'll notice also here that this is taking advantage of another feature that you can turn on with dynamic data, which is the idea that you can use a partial class and you can put in additional UI hints or required fields or that sort of thing. So have you seen these metadata validation parameters before? How many people? Okay, pretty good. So you're seeing these across the board in a lot of Microsoft things. You're seeing them in RIA services. You'll see them in dynamic data. You also see them in ASP.NET MVC2. That takes a lot more use of these. So the idea is that you're able to, you can say, like number one, you can say a field is required. I should have done a nice square. Let me try that for these. And then you can also say something like you can put a range. So you say, I want a range from 0 to 100. And then if it's out of that, it's actually going to give you a smart validation error message. So like, for instance, in this form, if I said quantity or unit price is 3,000, which one was it? Stock, okay. So here, if I say, no, that was the range for the slider, sorry. So that's my other thing. Let's see if I can screw this up by saying, let's try and put one on for one of the other fields. So we've got unit price. So let's do one for unit price then. We'll say range, and we'll say 50 to 1,000. And so then we need to name it the same thing. So we'll say public int, and then what did I say, units in stock? Unit price, thanks. And so it's not going to be a get, or not an integer. So let's drop down there. I think that's a decimal. All right. I have no idea if this is going to work, but it'll be fun if it does. Okay, so Server block's not well formed, so I messed something up. Up at the top here, I didn't do a... look at that, thank you. Okay, much better. Okay, so unit price now, let's set this to 5 or 2 or something. All right. I did something wrong there. The idea is that you're able to set, maybe it's because I didn't make it required. The idea is that you're setting at the attribute level. So that's where you're controlling those. One other thing I want to show off here with this is the idea of this UI hint. So there we've got units in stock. Units in stock is using a slider integer. And so that, we'll take a look over here, that's in this dynamic data area. So this is using field templates that are pulled over from dynamic data, but we didn't have to run a whole dynamic data application. And so here this slider integer is actually using it's Ajax control toolkit, it's got all this stuff. And so if you look at the form, when we edit one of these, you'll see this is actually using a slider control, and that number's changing underneath. So what's nice with these templates, and again, this applies across other things. You can use these in MVC as well. These templates allow you to say, anytime I'm using a date, I want to use a calendar pop-up. Or anytime I'm using so you can say, I want either for a specific type, date, time, integer, whatever, decimal, or you can say, for my specific case, I want a slider integer, and you've just defined a new type. And the way that's set up there is just by creating this ASCX, putting it in dynamic data folder over here on the right there, and then setting that UI hint. So that's right here. I wonder what I typed wrong on that range. Any questions on that so far? So what we've done there is we've taken an existing grid view, and we've just said, I want to use some of these features, or I want to turn on dynamic data features for this specific grid view. So there you get the automatic validation. The data annotations, which is what we looked up at the top of the page, and I mistyped something, but you were seeing that validation for the other ones. And then also the field templates, which is what I showed there with the UI slider. So, yes, question? Well, yeah, so that's exactly what we did. We had an existing grid, and so we do two things, or actually just one thing. We go in and we say, let me bring this up. Okay, so you say this. Now, I haven't built this, but so we say track list, which is my grid view, .enable dynamic data, type of, and then track. And track is my entity element there. So control dot. So in other words, it's probably easier to see on this one. So here whatever we're binding to, we just need to tell it what type it is. So this is a class of product, you'll see there, and that matches up to the class down below, which is the fields or the table we're binding to. So grid view is being bound to product ID, et cetera. And so all we have to do is that one line of code that says enable dynamic data for this grid. So that is this line right here. So that, in this sample, this is done in inline script. So it's just in your page init, grid view.enable dynamic data. Does that make sense? Yeah. Product in this case is a partial class, yes. So what's nice about that then is that's how you're able to set up the metadata, the data annotations for the metadata. So that's this here. So it's kind of a little weird to think of it that way because you've got the partial classes and all that, but that's the model that they're going with, and it is kind of nice to be able to have your metadata and data annotation stuff kind of all in one place. So. Yeah, there isn't there, and I'm not sure why that's not required in this case. I think it's because with the SQL data source, it's actually not creating a class. But when I've done that in the other example, it is required. So I'm not sure about that. I can look into that later. So, any other questions? Okay, so what we've done there is we've looked at just enable dynamic data for one grid. So now what I'd like to do is actually, let's hop over real quick and take a look at what a dynamic data site is like, because that's kind of a good, if you've got a site that is just a bunch of editing of tables, and all you've done is create a bunch of grids that edit tables, then what dynamic data does for you is very simply, it creates a full editing site. So let's go to, so we'll look real quick at what this looks like in a browser, and then we'll go through and I'll show you the code for it. So this is, I've just browsed to this site, and it says, you know, dynamic data site lists all your tables, and then when I click on one of these tables, it gives me a full editing grid here, and it has, you know, it has like this drop down at the top, which actually, you know, is going to let me pick between them. It has, like if I go to, for instance, an album. An album is related to artists, and it automatically generated, you know, this whole list of all artists for an album. So it's really pretty slick as far as how it's, you know, setting all this up. Here also you can see, again, you've got the drop downs and everything, associations. So dynamic data is a great way if you're just working on creating an editing admin type site. Really, really easy to get this up and running. It has you know, an insertion form, and also this is going to have all your validation set up. So, and the way that this is set up is really simple. You create a new site, and then you go in. You have in global. There's a few things where you have to say, you register, you just tell it what it's looking at. So in this case, I've created an entity model, which is in my app data. That's not. Actually, I didn't even have to do that, sorry. But I've just, there it is, Chinook entities. Go to definition. So it's an app code right here. So I created an entity model, and then in global ASAX, I just told it, enable dynamic data, and this is your model, and it pretty much generates the entire site for you. So does that make sense? Any questions on that? So that's actually, to put this in context here, we've got enable dynamic data allows you to turn on all those validation features for just one grid, and you get all the annotation support and all that stuff. And then in order to just turn it on for the entire site, you can do, check my time here, you can also just create an entire dynamic data site. One other thing that we're going to look at here is you have a third option, and we're going to show how in a site we can, I'm going to switch over a grid, and it's going to be using an entity framework model, and then because of that, we're going to use a query extender. And I'm going to show how you can do more advanced querying very easily with just declarative markup. So who here's seen the query extender? Excellent. Okay, I picked some good stuff then. So I'm going to jump into this. Okay, so what we've done is I've got an admin form, and okay, so I've taken my administration form. I've added an entity framework model, And in order to add an entity framework model, that's actually very simple. You go through and, so I'm going to go through some of the steps for this. So add new item. And then I'll say an entity data model. Pick the name, say add. And then I just point it at a database. You know, the standard kind of thing. So I'll pick what my table is that I'm going to be, or in this case, I'm just creating the whole thing. I'm going to tell it all the tables it wants to use. So just in case you haven't been through creating an entity model, it's not difficult. It's not scary. And once you've got that in place, then I can go through and turn on some of those features. So for my grid here, I'm giving away another surprise for later. But so I've got my entity data source, and that's just pointed at my grid. And then I'm using a query extender, and the query extender is really cool because you're able to just say, okay. So here I've got search expressions and range expressions. And there's a lot of other query extender capabilities that you can turn on. Let me see if any others jump out at me as interesting here. So dynamic filter, dynamic route, all kinds of stuff. The ones that I'm showing here, though, are just, I've got a couple of fields, and let me take that out for a second. Okay, so I've got a couple of fields, and then I've got, so for instance, I've got a text box, and its ID is name. And then I've got a query extender below, and the query extender search field, data field is name. So I just say search type is starts with, data field is name, and so it's kind of match those two together. So now let's see what that looks like. Keep hitting F5, which is not wise because I've got a bunch of stuff loaded up here. See if it did the right one. Okay. So now on top of this grid, you'll see those additional fields up there. And so if I can say, I don't know, fast. Okay. So it did that dynamic query for me right there. So very easy way to add in all kinds of additional filtering and all that. Let's try a range. Now, in this case, all my items, I think, are 99 cents. So this isn't that exciting. But let's say I do a range of 0 to 100, and get all of them. And then if I say, 10 to 100, I should get 0. And these these work together too. So if I've got a range and a search item, they're all gonna work together. So that's very handy. Again, declarative. All I did was I created an entity model, and then I used the query extender and pointed that query extender at, so I've got my entity data source, and then I pointed my query extender at my entity data source, and then finally I pointed the grid at the query extender. So does that make sense to everyone? Any questions? Yes? Okay, how's the text box involved? Okay, good question. So the idea is the text box name. So we'll look at the ID field of the text box. Okay, so you see up here it says search, and then it says ASP text box, ID equals name, right? And then if we look down below, when we set up our query extender, it says data fields equals name, and then it says control ID equals name. Actually, control ID is the one we're looking at, and so then that's the one that's going to say, and it matches them up. Okay? So, all right. So again, we've looked at the range. We've got easily turn on dynamic data fields for one thing. We've got enable dynamic data for an entire site. Here we're showing how we're doing just dynamic, bringing in dynamic data functions using the query extender for just that. All right. Okay, now we're going to take a look at routing. And the idea of routing is this site, as it's originally set up, it just has albums.aspx, artist equals artist ID equals so-and-so. And we want to turn on routing inside of our website. So what routing does is it allows you to have pretty URLs that say something like /artist name. And this is something that is kind of bled over from ASP.NET MVC. So does anyone have any questions? Are people generally familiar with the idea of what we're doing with routing? Okay. So let me show you how we set it up. So if we go, in order to set that up, we'll need to go into our global ASAX. So we have two calls here. In our application start, we say register routes, and we pass in route table.routes. So that's actually, that's a property of our application. And then we need to configure our route. So here we're only using one route. We could have a list of a lot of routes there. And the way routes are processed, they go top to bottom. So the first matching route is the one that's gonna take effect. So you can kind of think of it like URL rewriting if you've done that before, but it's a lot more advanced than that. So the idea is I type something into the browser, the request comes in, this sees a URL and it says, okay, I've got a URL, where do I send it to? So it says, okay, the name of let's look through the parameters here. We've got the name is album list. That's not really important for the routing, except that when we say, I want to use this specific route, so that allows us to talk to a specific route later if we want to say, I want to create a URL that uses this route, all right? Yeah. Okay, so next we say, what are we going to match on? So when a query comes in that has /album/artist, and that artist is a replaceable field, so /album/U2, then it's going to match on that. And then it's going to redirect it over to albums.aspx. True means validate, so we want to validate that this file actually exists. So the idea is we want to make sure this file actually is on disk. And then finally, at the end, we're passing our route value dictionary. So in this case, artist, it just is mapping those together. So what this allows you to do is I could say I could say albums artists, and I could map it to a different field if I wanted. Does this kind of make sense? Go ahead. Yeah. Okay, so you're asking, is this similar to the IIS rewriting in IIS 7?
Yeah, well, in MVC, you have to, because you don't have the extension, the ASP extension, you have to do a special configuration in Windows 2000, Server 2003, in order for the engine to catch.
Right.
Will this work in 2003 server?
Let me see. Normally, in order to do, I know in ASP.NET MVC, you have a file called default.aspx, and it's just left in place so that the request will come in. I'm not certain. I know, like in IIS 7, it'll work just automatically. That's it. Okay. 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 So everyone can hear that. That was a new feature in .NET 4, and that it allows extensionless URLs and backported to IIS 6. So, excellent, thank you. Okay, so then what this is going to do is in the, we go on the home page. So these are what the existing URLs used to look like. They're small print, but it's question mark, ASPX, blah, blah, blah. So, now we've got a pretty URL, and it's pointing directly across, so that all just worked. So if anyone's, just to make sure it's all clear, you may have used IAS rewriting in the past. Did anyone use that? Okay. And IAS rewriting is a way where you you intercept incoming requests and you say, if you meant this, this is what I want you to do. But all it did was redirect, basically. It was kind of like an internal redirect. And then you got to the page and you had to figure out what was going on. And there were problems with that. It was complicated, and it also, you ended up in a spot where you had to generate all those URLs yourself. You had to hard code them because ASP.NET had no idea what you were trying to do. You were doing stuff behind its back. So what's nice with this is you've actually got support throughout the framework for, now it's in front of ASP.NET. It knows what you're trying to do. And so, for instance, you've got support in the designers. You've got, so here, if I go, I think I can do this. You have all kinds of route parameters. Let's see, I'm trying to think where that is. So I can say, well, for instance, in my query extender, I could say route parameter. I had that in a different one. So here I've got ASP:control parameter, and I could say also ASP:route parameter. So yeah, so what this is doing here is anywhere that you previously could bind to a query string parameter, anything like that, you can now bind to a route parameter. And so for instance, in this page, then we've got on the albums page. That's exactly what we're doing. So if we go, okay. So our route parameters for our entity data source on this page are just saying route parameter artist, and that artist is not a query string, that's the route URL or the route parameter that was passed in. And then we just match that up in our where clause. Does that make sense? So again, it's a handy feature. It's nice for a lot of reasons, and one big reason is search engine optimization. Okay, because artist.aspx $ID equals 15 blah blah blah, that doesn't really do very well for search engines. But if you've got something right in the URL that's /artist/sting/ whatever album Sting was on, whatever, then that's going to show up very highly in a search engine. So, while we're on the topic of search engine optimization, there are some other cool features that are in ASP4. So we looked at routing, obviously. Then also you have, you're able to set meta parameters, so meta description and keywords. And that was something you could kind of do before, but they're a lot simpler to do now. And got more on that on the next slide. But redirection, that's also something that's easier to do now. So we looked, I'll go the second one first. We've got redirect to route. So again, that's showing how this routing is completely baked in through everything. So you can say redirect to route. And remember before where I said album list was the name of the route? And I said we'll kind of talk about this later. It's kind of only necessary when you're trying to call it. So this is an example where you can say route name, and I'll say redirect to route artist list, and boom, it's going to go right over to that. Also, we've got redirect permanent. And what redirect permanent does is where you normally would say response.redirect, that just tells the browser, oh, go over here now. When you say redirect permanent, that says this page is permanently moved. And so that's going to be better for your search engine optimization because you're going to have one canonical URL for that page. So, all right, I already talked about that. This is just showing the idea of the parameters that I showed you before, where you would have said query string parameter before, now you say route parameter. And here's the idea of these meta APIs. So these allow you to say meta description right in the page declaration, and then you also can do them programmatically. So what that lets you do, as this is showing, is you can say, you can programmatically say this is product description for a specific product and set it dynamically. So, all right, any questions so far? We're going to move on to cleaning up HTML. All right. So first of all, I always like to talk about why do this, because a lot of the time, the people that were pushing HTML standards were always just kind of a little gung-ho about it, but it came across as pretty religious, and it's not something you really want to do when you're just kind of being bullied into it. So I think that it's important to do clean HTML for the right reasons. So the biggest ones that I've seen are just flexibility and the ability to style something however you want to do. So I'll show an example here. The last year's MIX10 website, this was, I worked on this website, and this site was actually based off the PDC-08 website. And the PDC-08 website actually had 2 different skins, and we swapped them the week before the conference. So like 3 days before the conference, swapped in a totally new skin. So within 1 week, we turned on MIX09 website, and we swapped out the skin for PDC-08. And we were able to do all of that with just CSS reskinning. And these were all web forms applications. So in that case, these were all using ASP 3.5. And we had to do a lot of write our own markup stuff. We had to use list views. We had to stay away from all the controls that were going to inject markup, because we needed a really pure HTML to control things at the CSS level. So that's why. It's not just like a theoretical, like you should be doing this. It's really, once you have clean HTML, you're able to be so flexible with it. So the way that ASP.NET 4 handles handles the clean markup, it's got to be careful, because if you create a new website with ASP4, we know that what you're trying to do, we're going to start you fresh with clean markup. But if you're upgrading an old website, well, you may have relied on all those table wrappers and all that kind of stuff. So it's very cautious about it. So you're going to start up with your it's going to be set with this control rendering compatibility version, and it'll default to 3.5 when you create a new when you upgrade a website. And so you're going to want to go into your web config and change that after, in a controlled way. So let's look at that in the web config. Okay. All right, so that's it. So you're just going to want to take a look at that. And what that does for you is that's going to clean up your markup for a lot of things. So for instance, let's view source. So we have this, let me go to login control, that'll be better. All right, so if you look at this login control, the way this was rendered before, you would have a bunch of, it was all done with a table. It was all wrapped in tables, and they had extra border spacing and all that kind of stuff. Another place where you'd see a lot of this was in the menu control. And the menu control was completely rewritten for .NET 4. So I believe that's in here too as well. I've got a menu up at the top. So that's something where when you all you do is you flip that switch, and you'll get cleaned up HTML for those. You can read here, but this will go through and it'll strip off things. The menu I called out there, and it's especially any of the kind of controls where it was doing a lot of stuff, wrapping things, so like a login or a wizard or that kind of thing. And then at that point, you don't have all these nested wrap things, so it's a lot easier to set styles. Okay. So we looked there. This was already set for 4.0. Let's take a look at a page, and I wanted to show a. So if we go back to an album page, let's go to, for instance, this page here. I think we've got a lot of view state on this guy. I kind of purposely wrote out a huge list here. So we've got a huge amount of view state here. Right, so awesome. Okay, so what we can do on this for this default page, let's see if I can get the right one. So all we have to say is enable view state equals false. And there's a range of settings that we can take here. There's a lot of different control that you can have. The way view state used to work is you had to be really careful about it, and you didn't have a whole lot of control. If you tried to turn it off for everything, there was no real way to say, I don't want to use view state for everything. I just want it for this one little place. And with ASP4, you have that flexibility, so you can turn it off for the page and then on just for one specific control that you need to use it on. So let's refresh this page. And it's still going to have some view state, but it's going to be quite a bit less. Hopefully it's less enough that we can see. Okay, so tiny amount of view state there. Why is there still view state? Well, there are controls on the master page, like the menu and the login and all that. There's still other things that do require view state. However, we've turned it off at this page level, and so we've shut it off for this long, these two long lists that I've got there. So any questions on that?
Have a master page when I turn it off permanently?
Yes, it would. So, and then, like I was saying, you can go through and you can turn it off for everything, and then just on one thing, on one control, I can say enable view state equals true. So it's really nice to have. You could kind of do this before, but you had to be really careful about it. It was easy to break controls. So. All right. One other thing I wanted to look at was predictable client IDs. Wow, I've got a lot of those running. Okay. So let's take a look at that. Am I on time here? Okay. I'll make this kind of quick. So the idea with predictable client IDs is that before, client IDs were just generated. And so if you'd done the view source on any web forms page, you would get a control 00, control 00, blah, 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 all that stuff for nested controls. Those were all generated for you. And the problem with that was, number one, you couldn't do any styling with it. And number two, because your styles were crazy, right? I mean, your div ID equals control 00, nested placeholder this, all that. And even if you said, okay, that's fine, I'm going to copy that and use it, well, then if you put in another control, you throw the whole numbering off and you've ruined that. Also, if you had, if you tried to do any JavaScript, that was a problem too, right? Because if you want to grab an element by ID, well, you have no idea what that ID is going to be. So here, let's look, I believe, on the home page. Okay, so here's an example of that. Hopefully this is all set up where you'll see, main content, list view, control 0 div, right? So let's go into this. So this is in product list. So here I can say a lot of things. One is I can say client ID mode equals predictable. So that refreshed so fast, I'm a little worried about it. Okay. list view 1. Not sure why it's not. I'm going to skip on this for now because I have too many projects open. It's in a different one, so I'll see if I can get back to that later, but kind of short on time. The idea here is you've got different modes, so you can say static, client ID to mode equals static. When you do that, that's going to say, I don't want you to change this ID. I've taken control of this field. And then you can say predictable, and so what that does is it generates them in a much more sane way. So it doesn't put all these control 0, 0 and all that. It just builds them based on IDs that you have set. So, and then you can also say row data sort, or there's one where you can say basically, I want for this, each row, I want you to use this as a prefix. So if we get time, I can come back to that, but I don't want to miss some of the things towards the end here. Okay. Let's take a quick look at Ajax. So I had a bunch of demos, and then based on how things are changing around now, I'm not going to show some of those. But the one thing I did want to show is CDN for Ajax scripts. So in our script manager, okay. So here I've got two things that I'm showing. So there's two new things we've got here. One is enable CDN. What that's going to do is that's actually going to use the Microsoft Ajax CDNs, and that'll do that for you automatically. So that's going to pull those scripts off the CDNs. That's very handy. And then the reasons, is everyone pretty clear on the reasons why you'd want to use a CDN? I want to so they're fast, they're geolocated, so they're all over the world. So if you're in India, you're going to pull these Ajax scripts right off of a server that's going to be in India. Finally, probably the most important thing is that they're cached. So if everyone's using jQuery or Microsoft Ajax scripts off the Microsoft CDN, the browsers will cache those. And so if I hit your web page and you're using the CDN, and then I hit some other web page on some other website and it's using the CDN, my browser's already got that file cached. It's not even going to bother pulling it down. It's just going to say, oh, I've already got it. Okay, so that's all handy. And the way that this is set up is right here in the page. Now, you may wonder, why do I care about Script Manager and CDN and Ajax and all that? But this page actually, because it's using a grid view, there's a gridview.js file that's pulled down. And so that's going to be, let me see. So that's in my admin. Tracks. I don't know if I want to save changes. That's a little frightening. I'm going to say yes. Okay. So there's actually a gridview.js file that's pulled down. And it's, let me see. I think I've got Ajax disabled. And well, here's an example. Here's the perfect example. Is right there for the menu. So there we've got menu standards.js. So you'll see that the script source for that is ajax.microsoft.com, ajax, blah, blah, blah. It's automatically handled for me. So anyone that's using an ASP4 menu may very likely preload this script for you. You know what I'm saying? So we're all sharing the same scripts. So let me see. And then one other thing, I didn't have time. It was just announced this week and all that. But there is this new templating library for jQuery, which is pretty cool. So that's, I don't know, that's exciting. I wanted to show a little bit about charting. So on this form here, this is my track list. And we're going to paste in a chart. And again, this is all, you know, easy to bind to our same source. So here I've got an entity data model at the bottom. On top of that, I've got a query extender, and then I've bound both my data grid, or my grid view. Old habits die hard, huh? I'm binding my grid view and my chart to this. So for instance, I can say, I want to search for fast. So both my chart and my grid view are updated. So this is a very simple grid view I showed at the very beginning where we're looking at, you know, I dragged a table on. I've got an entity model, I've got a query extender, dropped a chart on, and all of a sudden, this is actually a pretty useful grid. I don't know what else I want. Rock. Let's search for rock. Okay. So, and this is all just kind of happening on the fly there. So, yes. What's that? How's that rendered? There are different options. This one is done. It uses an image handler and it writes out a PNG. So, and the chart actually, it was purchased from Dundas or licensed from Dundas. So it's a very, very extensive chart. It's got a lot of different options for. I don't have examples here. If you're interested, Scott Mitchell has a long series of posts that are all pretty relevant for it, and so you can do things like image maps. You can do dynamic. You know, when you hover over something, you call an AJAX action. It's pretty cool. So, and again, like this entire chart it's like, what, 20 lines of code? So for a lot of simple cases, I mean, this is like pretty hard to beat, right? And again, it's nice to bind a grid to a chart. So I don't know. I thought that was neat. All right. OK. So I wanted to just kind of, towards the end here, I thought it was fun. Just this week, they talked about SVG coming up in IE9. So I wanted to see if I could throw that into one of these. So let's see if it works here. I've got on my albums list. So you're not going to see it when I bring it up in here because this is IE8, and IE8 does not know about this. But I have installed the IE9 preview. And you may think I'm crazy because I've got IE8 on this machine, right? But the awesome thing that I'm so happy about with IE9 is that they're shipping these as it's side-by-side compatible. So let me see, did I delete that SVG? This should be in default. That would be the worst ever. SVG. Maybe I copied it elsewhere. Oh no, this is horrific. Okay, so. Well, I'm looking for this. I'm pretty close to the end here, so do we have any questions people would like to ask about? Not a single question? That's crazy. All right, well, you're going to watch me get SVG working then. Where did I have this? There's I've got a conditional comment. All right, well, I'll do it on the fly then. We'll do it live. I'm shocked and saddened there's not a single question. How many people here are doing 100% web forms? All right. Some web forms, some MVC. Cool. Who here got to the WebForms MVP talk this morning? Okay. If you didn't and you're doing WebForms, you really kind of owe it to yourself to check that out. So Damien and Datham are both in here, and they gave that talk, and it was really pretty slick. So let me see if I can. Well, I'll show you what it would have looked like. So if you do this, I had basically copied in stuff from here, and then it was data bound in. So so we had SVG charts and stuff. So what's cool with this SVG, and this is kind of way off the topic, but I was allowing time for questions here. We don't have a single question. What's cool about SVG is it's text, so it'll line up just in line, just the same as a div or whatever. So here, I'll see if I can copy one of these in. Okay, so I'm just grabbing. Long list. Okay. And I'll put that in. Okay. So if you want to leave now, that's great. If you have any questions you want to ask later, that's cool. And then please fill out an eval form and give super high marks for no real good reason. Okay, so let's look at this. Complete. Yeah, this is frustrating. Albums. Okay. Thank you.